Okay? So the firm can raise financing either internally from its savings account or externally by borrowing or selling shares in itself. And they can raise that financing, then they can put that money to work by making investments that hopefully provide for the firm's financial future. That again guides them along the firm's path, and they are hopefully making money for their owners. Okay? Now, all of those questions, we have to ask ourselves, how do we answer all those questions? And some of them are sort of, like I said, big picture, you sit down and ponder, what should the firm do? But the other ones are more direct, they are more specific. What should we invest in? How do we decide what good investments are? How do we decide how to raise the money for those investments? Those are very specific goals, and they can be answered in a very structured way. Right? And what we need in order to answer those questions is we need the firm's financial statements. We need the firm's financial history, and that is where accounting comes in. Okay? So in general, accounting and finance work together very closely. The teams at a company might be, sitting right next to each other. The entry-level positions in finance accounting are going to be very similar jobs. And it's only once you sort of get to the upper levels that these two things start to differ. And the way that they differ is that in general, accounting is invested in recording the financial history of the firm. So the firm makes decisions. The accountants figure out how to record those decisions in the financial statements of the firm. Finance is interested in taking those financial statements and looking towards the future. How do we look at what the firm's financial position is and then make decisions about how to invest and move into the future, right? But what that means is that to answer any of the financial questions that we just posed, we are going to need all of the financial recording, all of the accounting statements for the firm. Okay? So all of these questions are going to rely on the accounting information that the firm has generated over time. Okay? Once that's there, we're going to use a series of formulas and we're going to use a series of rules to decide things like what are good investments and how do we make decisions about them, and what sources of financing are appropriate and how do we value them and how do we think about raising them and things like that. Okay? So generally speaking, that's what this class is about. Those are the things that we're going to talk about, sort of in order, a little bit in order, and we'll spend about a chapter on each of those general topics. And there are some other topics that we'll talk about, but that's a general timeline for the class. Okay? Now, the rest of our discussion today, or in this lecture, is just going to be more about corporations and how corporations work, and sort of not necessarily finance things, but just to at least give you a little bit of a refresher on what a corporation is and how it should work. Okay, so hopefully the rest of this is things that you've heard before in general, either in your accounting classes or in your just sort of general business classes. But I just want to put us all on the same footing as we move forward into the rest of the class. So I want to talk a little bit about corporate structures. In other words, I want to talk a little bit about how we differentiate between different types of firms. Okay? Now, there are lots of different types of firms, but I really just want to focus on the sort of three big groupings of firms, three big types of firms, where we start with the simplest and we move to the most complex. Okay? So the simplest type of firm is actually extremely simple. It is called a sole proprietorship. And a sole proprietorship is so easy and so simple that you don't actually have to do anything to form one. In fact, you can do one sitting in your chair right now. You can just say, I'm going to start a company and it's going to be called Alex Holcomb Company, Alex Holcomb Incorporated, and boom, that's it. You're done, right? I've formed my own company. And a sole proprietorship is just that. It means you are the sole proprietor, the owner and the manager of this company, and that you are just you're not going to use any kind of legal documentation. You're not going to do anything complicated in order to get this rolling. Now, there are a few obvious and not so obvious benefits to that, and there are a few obvious and not so obvious drawbacks to a sole proprietorship. Okay? Now, the main benefit of a sole proprietorship is that they are quick and easy to set up. Again, you can just do it sitting there. For instance, my cousin and I, when we were in high school, we had a business that was, we were mowing lawns and putting in sprinkler systems for people. Wasn't huge. It was something we did in our spare time. But that was technically a sole proprietorship or a dual proprietorship, I guess. We didn't have any legal paperwork. We didn't pay any taxes, although I'm not sure I should admit that on video. But we weren't really making any money. But at the same time, we could have used that as the bones to develop a more structured business where we were, doing this for our livelihood instead of just doing this to make some extra money on the weekends. And it's as easy as that. We could have continued with no more legal or financial decision making other than that. We could just say we started a lawn care business, start cutting lawns, and we, as long as we're legally claiming all that appropriately with the government, that's fine enough to start a business, right? So the benefits to it are that it's so easy to and straightforward to establish and set up. The downsides are that you are paying taxes in a very specific way. You're paying taxes on all of that income as personal income, and that you have what's called unlimited liability. Okay, so unlimited liability means that you and the firm, you and the company have no distinction, no legal separation, which is tied up into this idea that it's so easy to start and straightforward to get rolling. You can just say, I'm a business now. And by doing that, you are not creating any legal distinction between you and the business. You are saying we're the same entity. I make the money because I am the business, and I pay the taxes because I am the business, right? I pay the business's taxes, and those are my taxes, and there is no sort of distinction between those two things, which is all well and good as long as your firm is of a certain size. But as you start to get larger and you start to think about maybe say adding some employees, we get, let's say we stick with the lawn care business, we get a little bigger, we get a little more profitable, we start adding people to our our roles as we start cutting lawns. It gets to be the point where my cousin and I can't do it all on our own, so we hire a few people to help us. We buy some trucks and some riding lawnmowers and all this extra equipment, and we do a few things, right? The first is we take out a loan to buy all that stuff, right? Because we can't afford to buy 5 trucks just out of our savings account, and trailers and all this equipment. And the second thing is that we now add liability from our employees to ourselves, right? So if for whatever reason the pandemic that comes out of nowhere means people don't want to pay to get their lawns cut anymore, we are personally on the hook for those loans that we took out. Right? We have unlimited liability for the business's liabilities, and that can be something like a loan. The bank can now come after me personally, my house, my own cars, my savings accounts, right? Because there's no separation, legal separation between the firm and myself, then any liability of myself or any liability of the firm can be commingled. They can come after my personal stuff to try and collect on business loans, which is not ideal as you start to get larger and those liabilities start to be larger, right? The second thing is that we have liability in other ways. And one of them can be that our employees are perhaps negligent, right? So we've got this one employee, he's cutting somebody's lawn, he's driving along as a riding lawnmower, he's rocking out to, whatever he's got on his headphones, he's not paying attention, and he runs over the neighbor's dog, right? And then the neighbor sues the company, and because there's no distinction between me and the company, or my cousin and I and the company, they can come after all our personal assets, right? So as easy as it is to start, as nice as that is for just getting a business up and off the ground, as you start to grow the business and evolve, you start to not just want the complexity, but need the complexity of creating some legal separation. In other words, separating the firm from yourself, creating the firm as its own entity. And so the second most common type of structure is called a partnership. This is a little more complex. It's still relatively straightforward to form. And there are lots of different types of partnerships. Probably the most common one that you'll see or have heard of is called a limited liability partnership, or an LLP, or a limited liability corporation, or an LLC. And you'll see that a lot with, say, professional groups like lawyers or doctors. They'll form a limited liability partnership when they form a law firm. And this is sort of hybrid. They are not completely forming a separate entity. At the same time, they are forming sort of a wall between the company and the owners. But the owners are generally still the operators of the firm, and so they are still tied together quite intimately. But they are, hopefully, you can see that in the name, limited liability company or partnership. They're hopefully limiting their liability for things like by building this wall in between the company and the owners to hopefully protect themselves against things like that. Now, partnerships aren't a perfect solution either. While they are easier to set up, they do still require some legal wrangling and filing. You have to form a partnership agreement, which means all the partners have to sign a document saying what the company is and how long it's going to exist and what the goals are and all those kinds of things. And if the partners start to dissolve, or if the company starts to fall apart, then the partnership agreement gets dissolved and this whole separation falls apart, right? Now that's actually one of the things that is also going to be a downside here. And it's a downside of a sole proprietorship too. I just didn't mention it. One of the bigger downsides, I guess, of both of these forms is that you have no easy way to move on from the business, right? So say my cousin and I had made this lawn care business, this sprinkler business, relatively profitable, and we had turned it into a pretty good operating business just in high school. But by the time we got ready to go to college, we wanted to move on from it. But while we could just leave it, just say, hey, we're not doing this anymore, and sell all the tools and stuff that we had, we could have just done that. If we had done that, we would have been missing out on some other intrinsic value in the firm, and that is we wouldn't have captured the value of the business as an ongoing venture, right? We could have tried to sell everything, right? There is still value in the firm outside of just my lawnmowers. And the value was the fact that there were all these people, there was a whole list of people that were going to pay me to keep cutting lawns. So the ideal way to exit that business is to sell it and all of the customers to someone else who's willing to continue the business. That way I capture all of the value, but that's quite difficult. Difficult in lots of different ways for a sole proprietor, because mostly I would struggle to find someone who was interested in buying it, and they would struggle to find someone who was interested in selling that kind of business, right? So if something happens to a sole proprietor, if you die, or if you just want to move on and do something else, you struggle to be able to move on and capture the value from your business. Now, a partnership has some of those same issues. For instance, if one of the partners dies, the partnership agreement is legally dissolved, and so the firm is in this sort of legal limbo until it can rewrite a new partnership agreement with different partners. It's also a little more difficult for the partners to sell and say move on to something else, although it is easier than a sole proprietorship, because one of the ways that a partner can move on is by selling his share of the partnership to the other partners, right? So there is a sort of more direct and obvious way for partners to move on, but it's still not easy.